All right, guys, our favorite time of the week when we get to answer a few of your questions. Saagar, what do we have up first?
Number 1, Stacey Assel. Who are the good ones? We hear so much about all the bad politicians. It almost feels like all of Washington is corrupt. Who do you think is doing a great job? Who is not being recognized but should be?
Here's the problem is, I think, first of all of these politicians in Washington have agency. They signed up for a tough job, and they should be held to account for their failures to uphold the principles that they were elected on. However, when you see a system that churns out failure and mediocrity time after time after time, no matter who you send, you've got a problem with this system itself. And actually, this gives me an opportunity to plug something that I've been working on. Andrew Yang's coming out with a book. I just talked to him in a long interview that we're gonna send out to you guys about that book. And I have some issues with his tactical decisions around starting a third party, which we get into in this interview, but he recognizes this same problem that, you go to Washington and you said you're gonna do all these things, and sometimes you're really, intent on it. You're really mean to do it.
Right.
And then somehow the system, just crushes you and you end up not doing any of it. So I think the bigger issue is not even so much the failed individuals as it is a system that bakes failure into it and that, requires you to have this duopoly system where both your choices sort of suck, that requires you play to this kind of sectarian conflict rather than focusing on areas where you have, mass mandates to do things like get people health care and lift their wages, et cetera. So that to me is where the real issue lies, and that's why it's hard to say, there's a good one.
That's why I'm glad you said that, because they will always disappoint you. And in a way, it's not their fault. Obviously, yes, they have agency, but the way that everything is designed, it's made so that they have to disappoint you if they want to survive. And look, like you said, they could leave and they could speak out, but these people are all human beings, and that's the issue. So I've been here long enough, and I haven't even been there long, in order to see a lot of people I believed in ultimately blow up on the national stage. People who I knew personally say one thing behind the scenes and then say another thing when the camera's on, all because they got to eat, or they think it's going to help on this, they think it's going to help on that. It's not, it's like you said, there is an architecture that exists in which people vote exactly based on certain things. People in this town have it wired to where the fact that they can push things as far as they need to satisfy special interests while also getting the votes of the base that they need. And as long as we have that, it's gonna be a tough sell.
Yeah.
I don't know what else to say.
Indeed. All right, second question from Qasim Rother. That's how Qasim in my district says it, so hopefully I'm getting that right. Ideologues in Congress. What percentage of Congress would you say are ideologues? I started watching Veep after you guys mentioned how it was one of the more accurate fictionalized portrayals of DC, because they're ridiculous and incompetent. And noticed that the main characters are mostly opportunists who don't have very firm convictions. What would you say, Saagar? Kind of related to the first question.
99.9%. Yeah, everybody here is an opportunist. I've noticed this, actually. I know a lot of people who work at the RNC. A lot of them are not ideological whatsoever. They just grew up Republican. That's it. And they're like, oh yeah, this is my thing. And then you get into the game, you get to go to the parties, and you get to go to all this stuff, and then soon it becomes your livelihood and your job, and you're locked in. I know a lot of Democratic operatives, and they're pretty much the same. Yeah. A lot of it is just how do I work for person? They don't care whatsoever about policy. Most of them don't know anything about policy. That's actually the most shocking thing. Reporters, many journalists are exactly in the same league, and that is why Veep is a very accurate representation.
Yeah, there's definitely a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
You see someone like Mitch McConnell, and that dude has zero principles other than he's pure opportunist. Right. That's one end of the spectrum, and frankly, there are a lot of people who fall at that end of the spectrum. I think oftentimes the people who are the most ideological, which I don't know if Qasim is using this in a positive phrasing, but I consider it to be a positive thing to have an ideology and have actual principles that you stick to rather than just being opportunistic. A lot of times the people that you see that are actually still trying to hold true to their principles are the new members who still remember what it was like before they were on the inside. Trail. Right. Yeah. You think about AOC showing up and protesting outside of the speaker's office. You think about Cori Bush camping out on the Capitol steps and shaming her own leadership, who did not want her to do that, and that was a truly courageous move. You see occasionally you see these flashes you might see on foreign policy. You might see a libertarian doing something that's uncomfortable for the Republicans. You may see a Democrat, someone like Ro Khanna, going against what his establishment wants him to do. So you do see some of these flashes from people who still remember that they had principles and then they're trying to hold true to those principles. I wouldn't say it's 100% across the board, but again, the longer you're here, the more you're ground down by it, the more that you convince yourself like, oh, the way to actually affect change and stay true to my principles is to go along to get along, to vote with the party, to be loyal, to move up the ranks in the system. And so that's why you see over time what manifests as it just looking like everybody being completely opportunistic.
There you go. All right, next question.
Question 3, Leslie Simpson. What does she have to say?
New York Times and the Washington Post. You both seem to have a complicated relationship with the New York Times and the Washington Post, denouncing their coverage or lack of coverage of various issue, often factually citing their articles for breaking point stories. How do you reconcile this? P.S. I love your show. Thanks so much for your incredible insights.
Thank you, Leslie. Okay, so it's a good question, actually, because we live in the media ecosystem that we live in. Yeah. These are the outlets that are spending money and resources doing original reporting. So we have no choice but to rely on them. I wish there was a fully, financed and large-scale independent media ecosystem that we could exclusively rely on. That's just not reality. So what we try to do is we try to highlight instances where the reporting is important, where it's sound, and we try to be very skeptical in the way that we approach their stories.
Yes.
So especially when it comes, I think, in particular, to foreign policy, when you got a bunch of quotes on background from, military-industrial complex types, those are stories you should be particularly skeptical of. So that's what we try to do, is sort through the reporting itself, see if it holds up, see if it's, how it's sourced, and if the people who are involved in that story have an axe to grind and think about what their interests are, to try to filter it out as best we can. Now, sometimes there are times when we get fooled too, and we have to come back and be like, you know what, I bought that story, and that turned out to be total and complete bullshit. But I would posit that our track record has been pretty decent in seeing through some of the spin and manipulation, but ultimately we have to live and create in the media ecosystem as it exists, so we just do our best to filter through and find the pieces that are accurate and that are significant and highlight the areas that are being completely ignored.
Right, so whenever we point to a Washington Post story, either A, we'll know the reporter, we know their track record, we can trust it, but B, it's also, like she said, news gathering, which is that, look, I mean, we don't have millions of dollars to hire somebody to go and chase Congress people around Capitol Hill. And even if we did, they wouldn't talk to us because we don't work at the Washington Post or the New York Times. Right. If I want to use a quote, where am I going to go? It's about news gathering resources. The New York Times has bureau chiefs in Kabul or whatever, right? So we can rely on that reporting. That would cost over $2-3 million in order to try and replicate just on ourselves. So you have to think about it that way. It's about the absence of a better alternative while also being able to recognize that they can have, in some cases, decent news gathering, but that the blind spots in their coverage where we can fill in is also dramatically important. But, it's an important question, and I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, next up, Elaine Lovato. I like this question. Stock market equals graph of rich people's feelings. Can you explain why you call the stock market a graph of rich people's feelings? I'm a solidly middle-class nurse, not a rich person. My ability to retire depends on my 401k, which is affected by the stock market. I get concerned when I see my retirement savings decline. Can you elaborate your stance on the stock market? What would you say, Saagar?
No, it's an important point. And we're not denigrating you. What we're saying is that you don't control the market. And it's like, no offense to you, but a small group of people generally are the ones who pull the levers and make the values go a certain way. And we've designed our retirement system such that you and many other people, including myself, 401ks and more, is dependent upon those whims. And that's actually part of the problem, which is that when you have people with such heavy sway within the markets and their ability to move them up or down or in whichever way that they want, it affects real middle-class people like yourself. So my wish would be that the stock market would be a graph of middle-class people's feelings, of regular people's feelings, but the reality is very much distorted away from that in terms of consumer value, in terms of the gamemanship, and so much more.
Yeah, and oftentimes it's wildly disconnected from any fundamental value of the company stocks, certainly wildly disconnected from how middle-class people are actually doing. And you can see the way that this rigging comes back to bite working class people. In the housing crash of 2008, some of the investors that got hit the hardest were pension funds that took massive
Still haven't
hits.
made it back.
So the way that this worked, just to overly simplify it, is on one end you have the homeowners who are getting screwed and preyed upon and pushed into mortgages, sometimes outright fraud, and their signatures forged and like insanity going on. So they're pushed into these mortgages. And then ultimately everybody along the chain, as you go up the chain from the local bank and the appraisers to these things getting packaged up together and bought and sold on Wall Street, the people who disproportionately ended up with what we later came to find out was garbage all packaged together, a lot of those were pension funds. So you have the working class people getting screwed on the front end, and then the fake garbage that's getting packaged up, ultimately you're getting screwed on the back end too, because it's ending up in your pension fund. So that's like a little window into just how rigged and screwed this whole process is. But to put it really simply, why I describe it as a graph of rich people's feelings is because it's so disconnected. The performance of the stock market is so incredibly disconnected from how actual regular people are doing. So to be totally clear, Elaine, I want your 401k to do well. I want you to be able to retire and be comfortable and have security in all of that. So this has nothing to do with, me not wanting your retirement account to ultimately
Exactly
succeed.
right.
All right, last question here. Kyle Stanbaugh, vocal warm-ups. What vocal warm-ups do you guys do before the cameras roll to get that perfect diction? That is very flattering and complimentary, and at least for me, I do not feel like I deserve it. But we don't do anything.
I drink coffee and water. That's pretty much it. Yeah.
So I just do water, and I don't like, one thing I will say, I prefer the water to be a little more room temperature. I find cold water affects, I don't know, it makes me kind of like phlegmier somehow or something. So yeah, and it is weird. I try to work out in the morning, short, like a 20, 30-minute workout, and that helps me not so much vocally, but it helps my brain to actually function. So that's what I would consider sort of like my warm-up and my process in the morning. I like to sort of listen to music while I'm doing my makeup and get hyped up. But in terms of actually doing vocal warm-ups, we don't do any of that.
Yeah, there's no vocal warm-ups.
We just jump right in.
Kind of funny. Yeah, I mean, my only warm-up is to drink as much water as possible because I over-salivate, which you all know, and give me a Sorry, it's genetic. I can't do anything about it.
Over-salivate.
Yeah, that's the only thing I got.
That's really a burden to bear.
It is it's a true genetic burden that I have to bear. Who knew that I'd have to go into TV, but so be it.
All right, guys, we love you. Have a great weekend, and we will see you back here tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.